So in this recording, we're going to look at the Sentry question from section 4, which is a recap of this question that we covered in class. And the purpose of this week's session was all around the budgetary process in an organisation. So steps a company goes through in setting their budget, what's a good budget, what's a bad way to use the budget, and particularly around the behavioural implications or challenges around setting budgets. So participation, motivation, responsibility, and control. But in terms of the numerical aspects, what we're also looking at is one aspect is planning, where budget is, but the other important aspect of the manager's role is control. And this is how do you compare budget to actual and how do you interpret the results. And you will often get these in terms of weekly or monthly reports. You'll get budget versus actual for the month, year to date, budget versus actual for a number of columns. And you're trying to interpret what the figures are. And we want to show you the different things you need to consider to get a meaningful comparison. So in the Sentry example, they're asking us in part A to prepare a flex budget for 9,000 units and 13,000. And then in part B, they're asking us to comment on the performance in comparison to the flex budget and reconcile the original budgeted profit to the actual profit, identifying the volume variances and the flexible budget variances. So we'll talk you through each of those terminology. The first concept we're looking at here is the idea of a flex budget. And this is where you, as the name suggests, you flex your budget depending on where your actual level of output occurs. So we can see here, this Sentry, a t-shirt manufacturing company, they budgeted to have 10,000 units. But again, remember, your budgeted volume and your actual volume may be different. So what we provide in management accounting is we provide this tool called the flex budget. As the name suggests, you flex your budget up or down to match the actual level of volume. So we're trying to compare like for like. So if the actual output was 9,000, we flex our budget to what would our budget look like if it was 9,000 to begin with. Or if our actual sales were 13,000, well then we flex our budget upwards to see what would our overall budget have looked like if we had budgeted for 13,000. And what we're borrowing here is this concept which we covered earlier on this year, this semester, called CVP analysis, cost, volume, profit analysis. So there is an overlap in the areas, because we know if we flex the volume, certain costs go up or down, the variable costs, but other costs don't change, which we call the fixed costs. So there's a nice overlap here. So what I'm going to do then is we have our original, and we're just going to make this a small bit smaller. What we're just going to do then is we're going to put 9,000 units here. We'll call this then, we'll put it up there, 9,000, and we'll call that flexed 1, and we'll call this then flexed 2, which is based on 13,000. So this is a quite straightforward concept, and it's an application of CVP, but it's important because this starts us on our role in terms of comparing budget to actual. So what we're trying to say is, well, what would the budget have looked like if we had budgeted for just 9,000 units? Or what would the budget look like if we had budgeted for 13? So you're flexing your budget based on CVP principles. So your revenue here will be 9,000 units times 6, because our budgeted sale was €6 a unit. Your direct materials will be 9,000 times 1.1. Your direct labour will be 9,000 times 0.7. So these are all based on the budget. You're flexing the budget, you're ignoring the actual for now. So you can leave that column C for now. And your variable overheads, 9,000 times 0.3. Right, so just tidy up those just to make sure they're the same format. Make it easier. And then the key thing to watch here is your fixed overheads, budgeted 6.5, they will stay 6.5. So the logic there is, that is a fixed cost. So if volume changes, your fixed cost stays the same. That's a basic principle of CVP analysis. And then of course, if we flex it to 13,000, you will have now 13,000. We're assuming the same sales price per unit, 6. Direct materials will be 13,000 times 1.1. Your direct labour will be 13,000 times 0.7. Your variable overhead will be 13,000 times 0.3. And remember now, your fixed overhead will not change. So your profit then will be higher because you're selling more units. It'll be 44,200. So that's what we're just trying to say is when actuals come out, the actual volume, we want to get a like-for-like comparison. And that's how you do it. You flex your budget based on which you think are variable costs, which you think are fixed costs. So it's quite a nice overlap with the previous area. But now we probably get to a more important point, is your part B. And say the actual results are provided below now for January, and you actually only made a profit of 23,600. And what the question is asking you, requirement 2, is comment on the performance. And they want you to reconcile the original budgeted profit to the actual profit, identifying 2 different types of variances, a volume variance and your flexible budget variance. So let's just, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hide these again, and I'll bring them back in a second. But let's just focus now on original versus actual. So what we're looking at here is the actual profit compared to budget. So if you're looking at the original budget versus actual, you would have a variance of minus 9,000 total variance. So what that means is your budget versus actual profit, you're 8,900 adverse, lower than expected. Now, if we do a very crude analysis, which often happens, you go line by line, budget versus actual. So let's do that, and we'll call it here your variance, which is often called BVA. Budget versus actual. And we're saying the original budget was 60, your actual revenue is 49.5. So you go minus 60 plus this, you can do it various ways, but it's going to be 10,500 adverse. So your revenue is 10,500 lower than expected. So we'll just do them down each first, and then I'll tell you about some of the limitations of looking at it that way. Same here, it'll be minus 11. Let's copy it down. You will have minus 10, minus 11. So that would be, apologies, got the wrong way around. That will be plus 200. So it's minus 10.8 plus your 11. So you have 200. What that means is actually you spend 200 less than expected. Because it's lower, that's a positive. Here, it'll be 1,600. This one, it'll be 300. They're all lower than expected. And just this fixed overhead is higher. So that will be adverse. So the negative ones means the actual is bigger for costs. The positive one means the actual is lower. And hopefully when we net them up, we will also see that it's minus 8.9. So you can see the split out the total will give you the total variance. But in accounting, we actually come to the conclusion that's not a great way of comparing like for like. Because you have to remember here, you're not comparing the same things. This was a budget for 10,000 units. Right? This is the actual performance for 9,000 units. So you're not really comparing like for like. And as we'll see in a second now, that's going to lead to misleading variances and probably then misleading decisions about control. So just to take an example of each line item, take for example the revenue. We know we're down 10.5. But that may not necessarily be fair because some of that is due to a volume decrease because you sold 1,000 or 10% less units than budget. There may be another piece that's due to price. So in an accounting and particularly in performance measurement, you want to be able to idea or understand what exactly is driving that. So we can split out what portion of that is due to a decline in the volume and what portion is it due to a change in the price. So maybe you didn't sell it for €6 per unit. So we can split that out. Likewise here, for example, direct materials, that gives a false impression that you actually spent less than expected. But no, technically you did, but the problem is you spent 10.8 on 9,000 units where you only expected to spend 11 on 10,000. So clearly on a pro rata basis, if you looked at it like for like, based on what your budget for 9 would have been compared to the actual spend on 9, it would be adverse. So without stripping out the impact of volume, you're going to come to misleading variances on a lot of these. So what we do now is we're going to look at, that's how we look at like for like, is we split it and say, what portion of the variance is due to a change in volume? And because you've sold less than expected, that's going to be a negative variance because you're losing out on some profits. But everything else then we call flexible budget variances, or you might call your true like-for-like variances is ignoring volume on a like-for-like basis, did we spend more or less to make the same amount of units? And that will allow you then to allocate responsibility to the particular people. Because, for example, direct materials, they may have no impact. The direct materials manager in the factory, may have no power over the volume of sales. So that's not really a direct comparison. What you should be comparing is what would the budget have been for 9,000 units compared to what the actual spend was for 9. So a like-for-like comparison will give you a lot more information. Right? And that's a similar logic that can be done for currency. So for example, if you're getting a budget on a currency at the start of 2020, but then your budget versus actual each month is done on the actual exchange rate, unless you have power to manage that exchange rate through hedging, etc., it's not a like-for-like comparison. Maybe those budget versus actual should be done on a constant currency basis. And any movement between that currency and the actual currency should be isolated, like we're going to isolate the volume variance. And that can be done for a number of things, depending on your business model. So we're just trying to look for a fairer comparison and a better insight into budget versus actual. So what I'm going to do is just unhide these again. Unhide them. And we're now going to look at, I'm just going to delete one or two. So I'm going to put your flex budget over here. So we'll bring them down, we'll copy them down, it'll probably be the cleaner thing. And we'll work our way down, just to have it neater. And I'll just take the actual out. Or the original. That's the one I want to take out. So what we're looking at now, let's clear that. We're now going to compare actual to flexed. So we see before, we've said, actually, the original budget was based on 10, and the flex budget is now going to be based on 9,000, because you flex the budget to the actual output. The difference here between the 32.5 and the 28.6, that's your volume variance. Your volume variance here is your 28.6 minus your 32.5. Because you sold a lower volume, overall you have a lower expectation of profit. 32.5, and that is 3,900, which is adverse. So we're saying we can explain 3,000 of that 8,900 solely because you sold 10% less. And that's because you're losing money by selling less units. The less volume you sell, the less contribution you're coming in. Right? Just out of interest, and for revision of CVP as well, that can also be gotten by saying every unit, if you want to think of the contribution per unit, is €6 sales minus 110 materials minus 70 cent labour minus 30 cent variable overheads. So every unit sold has a budgeted contribution of 6 minus 1.8, 2.1, 3.9. So this is where it comes from. And because you sold 1,000 units less, it's 1,000 less 3.9. So you're losing 3,900 contribution to profits because you sold less volume. So the area of CVP is linked to this idea. You lower the volume, you lower the profits. Right? So we can isolate that, and maybe some person is accountable for that. Or what some people do in certain organizations is that might be attributable to a decline in the industry and not necessarily a decline in your market share. So there are more complex variances that you can now dig deeper and say, actually, that shouldn't be attributable to us because the overall industry is declining. So certain industries are in decline, and that may be an accepted part of where the revenue position is going. So it just depends on which company you're looking at. So of the 8.9, we've already explained 3.9. That's the volume difference. But now we get to the more important variances is, right, if we've gone from original to flexed, that explains some of it. We're now going to go flex to actual. So we're bringing in a new step. Instead of comparing original to actual and getting misleading variances, as we've done earlier, we're now going to compare like for like. And this is a much fairer comparison. We're saying if you had budgeted for 9,000 units, what would the budget look like? And compare that to the actual performance of 9,000. So I call this flexed versus actual. F versus A. So here you're going to be short 4,500. Now I'll come back and interpret them at the end, don't worry. We'll just do our calculations first. Here you are short 900, i.e. you spent more than the flex budget suggested. Here you're actually positive 900. That means you spent less on labour for 9,000 units than you would have expected. Then we have here is nil because you spent exactly this for 9,000 units expected, 30 cent a unit. And in this case, you're minus 500. because your fixed overheads were 500 bigger than you budgeted. And if we sum up these flexible budget variances, we call them, are 5,000. And notice the link there. The 5,000 flexible budget variances, that's true like-for-like performance. So ignoring the impact of volume, which may not be the responsibility of some people, you're still 5,000 worse off than budget. So some people need to be held accountable. And you add that to the volume variance, which gets your total budget versus actual. Now that can be a very powerful thing to do if you have some particular items such as volume. You might have currencies, you might have commodity prices that you want to isolate. And then you'll compare on a like-for-like basis everything else. So it's more to ask yourself, what way do we lay out budget versus actual, and is it giving us misleading comparisons? So for example here, take our revenue. Our initial revenue, budget versus original actual, was here, 10,500 adverse. But we know that's a mix-up of volume because we sold 10% less units and a mix-up of price. This just isolates for price now. Because if we sold 9,000 units at €6 each, we should have got 54 in. We actually sold 9,000, and if you work it out, 49.5 divided by 9, you only sold it for 550. So we're isolating particular impacts of what's driving. That's what variances do. You can isolate what's driving particular elements. So we can see here that 4.5 is solely coming from price, nothing to do with volume. Same for materials. Previously we had a misleading variance that said we actually had a favourable variance, but that ignored the fact that actually the same cost was making 1,000 less units. When you compare on a like-for-like basis, you were way over budget. What was hiding that was having the bigger volume in. Labour, you were ahead. Variable overheads, you were flat. And fixed overheads, you were behind. But that's what we want you to practice now. And we want you to go on to the next set of questions in terms of FernCo and LabCo, and trying a similar logic in terms of interpreting what's going on. So in this case here, volume is down, but the big driver here is revenue as well. So if I was asking you to comment, one of the most worrying things here is the revenue management. Not only did you drop your price because your flexible revenue variance is down, you sold them for 550 instead of €6, you're losing a lot of volume as well. So you don't have the information in the question, but you have to raise the problem is we need to investigate that, as well as investigating why direct materials were a lot higher than expected. Right? So hopefully you're getting an idea of how accounting can give you the tools and methods to improve your budgetary control perspective. It's not going to be perfect because not every budget can be exactly done by number of units, and when you get to the real world it can be a bit more complex. But we're trying to show you the principles and the pitfalls that can arise when you misuse accounting information. Because if you relied on these budget variances, as we did initially, they can be very misleading and they can hide actual true performance, and that can be wrong decisions, but it can also result in a demotivated workforce. Right? So that was Sentry, the in-class example around budgetary control.